Welcome to BIV Today, the daily podcast from the newsroom of Business in Vancouver. I'm Kirk Lapointe, publisher and editor-in-chief. Deloitte Canada and LifeWorks Research Group have released a follow-up report arising from 2021 research of senior leaders in Canada, which demonstrated that during the pandemic, they've become fatigued, insufficiently supported in their roles, and many of them contemplating a departure. And the report examines some strategies, though, to contend with executive exhaustion. And my guest today is the executive advisor at Deloitte Canada, Zabeen Hirji. She joins me now. Good to see you.
Thank you, Kirk, for having me.
Yeah, well, I will say I wouldn't consider myself a senior leader, but I have a leadership role here. This report speaks to me and almost every other manager I know. So take us through the initial findings, what Deloitte and LifeWorks found last year.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And I think just your comment around how this applies very broadly, and certainly you're a senior leader in your organization, but we see managers experiencing many of the same issues. So some of the highlights from our initial research, we found over 80% of leaders said that they finish work every day mentally or physically exhausted. We also found that about 50% were considering some sort of change to work, whether it was retiring, resigning, just dialing down, moving into a less demanding role, or actually taking a leave. We also heard that 96% of leaders told us that their mental health and well-being had worsened through the pandemic. And so, the headline here for businesses is that this is not sustainable, and it really does put at risk the recovery of businesses and the ability to really deliver sustainable performance. Yeah. And one of the reasons that we did this research is because there's a lot of focus on this issue, or certainly increasing focus on this issue for the broader workforce. And we're super happy about that, because certainly this is something that applies to everyone. But there was this sense that perhaps leaders were immune from this, that leaders could manage through it and soldier on. And what we discovered, of course, was that's not the fact. And maybe one more stat that I'll put out there before we get into the so what can we do about it, is the whole issue of stigma. We found that leaders are really, really concerned that if they raise their mental health issues in the workplace, it will affect their career trajectory. And that really is the first step in terms of how we overcome that, so that you start to normalize that a little bit.
Yeah, so lots to unpack here. It's interesting, though. I mean, the research was done in the spring of 2021. Now, you could kind of speculate both ways on this. You could say, well, that was the worst of the pandemic. That was the real heave-ho, pivoting, resilience phase of all of this. Here we are a year out. Now, where would you come down on this one? Would you think it has deepened and worsened, or would people be kind of coming out of this now?
Yeah, it's a great question. There has been more recent research. LifeWorks has done some research on this, and certainly they're seeing similar trends. Deloitte in the US has done work that actually looked at senior leaders. And again, these trends continue. And what I would say anecdotally, even the way we started this conversation, you sharing your experience, and I speak with leaders almost every day, as do my colleagues across Deloitte. And this issue has a lot of resonance, and there is a cumulative effect of everything that's happened over the last 2.5 years. And what we're also seeing, one of the reasons that the pandemic had such a significant impact on leaders is it really put into imbalance this framework where where generally leaders have more control over the environment and the actions that they take and the strategies of the organization. What happened through the pandemic is they lost that control, or certainly the control really was decreased because we didn't know where the pandemic was going, how long it was going to be, what are the government regulations? Are you going to be open? Are you going to be closed? Are you going to be somewhere in between? And so they were really operating in this very turbulent environment. If you think about what's happened in 2022, we've seen that continue. So you have the war in Ukraine, and that has just exacerbated supply chain issues, energy issues. You have inflation, you have a looming recession. And all of those things really fit into that same category of what's next and how am I actually going to deliver on my on the needs of the business. So I would say, with looking at all of those factors and the additional research, that I think we're in the same place, and there's a risk. Your question is really, really important, because there's this risk of organizations saying we're coming out of the pandemic, or certainly, there's the trajectory looks different. We've got vaccines, and much of that has helped to perhaps mitigate things a little bit. But the reality is that there's just more and more change being piled up on us.
It is one of the reasons why a study like this sticks out, is that a lot of people don't feel sorry for the boss, right? I mean, the boss has authority, better pay packet, presumably more privileges, and it's not easy to get sympathetic for the person at the top, is it?
Yeah. I'm so glad you asked that question. And in fact, when we did the research initially, we didn't know what the findings were going to be, although anecdotally we were starting to hear it. And we were a little bit concerned about the very things that you speak about. But that actually was not the reaction that we had to it. And I think there are a number of reasons for it. Through the pandemic, the relationships between managers, leaders, and employees changed. What happened is it became more human. We started to see, in fact, what we're seeing a little bit here today. We started to see people in very different environments, and leaders who had their children running around in the background, or their cat climbing up over their shoulder, or their doorbell ringing and to take care of something. And this humanization of the relationship, I think, really brought to life for employees, for sure, about how leaders were grappling with many of the same things as they were. But if you move that up to an organizational or even an economy level, it becomes even more critical. So leaders make strategic decisions. They make decisions around performance, operations, people. And if they're not healthy and well, then the quality of the decisions are going to suffer. If they're not healthy and well, their behaviors often change. The behaviors that come from stress and risk of burnout, and that trickles down in the organization to and employees in the workforce actually feel it. And this is where, for me, what we hear on planes when we're flying, although I know we're not flying as much, but certainly we are told to put your own oxygen mask on before you can help anyone else. And that's exactly what plays out for leaders as well.
And I certainly know a lot of managers who put themselves into the space where they'll take care of themselves, make sure that they have self-care, that they're exercising, they're eating well, they're trying to sleep well, those kinds of things. But the report, and we can get right into the recommendations around this one, You mentioned earlier the stigma issue and how difficult it can be for a lot of people who have exercised authority over time and have seen to be the people who are most together, the most, that have, that after all, they've been successful. For them to concede their own vulnerability, their own frailty, their inability to cope, the qualities that are kind of crowding in on them from a psychological standpoint takes a great deal. And then for an organization also to recognize that it's not just a matter of having that person solve his or their own issues, but it's up to the organization to start to take this much more seriously right now. So talk a little bit about these twin recommendations, the self confession, if you want to call it that, and the organizational requirement to really get in the game on this one.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, you're really highlighting this, this what could sometimes even hold people back, organizations back from doing anything. So in terms of stigma, not a surprise to see that I spent my career, my full-time, full-on career in the corporate world. As you may know, I was the head of HR at RBC, and so very much in this space. And the stigma issue. So what can you do? I think that's the question. We know it's there, and it's going to be there unless organizations take certain actions. So what we've seen happen, and I think that's what we're really trying with the report, that's what we're doing, sharing what we've learned from what other organizations are doing. They're having conversations at the senior most levels. And when you have the CEO leading the conversation, senior leaders leading the conversation, and being vulnerable enough, an important a theme that you point to say, you know what, I've had my challenges too. This is what my challenges have been. And there's a whole spectrum, right? Of mental health, et cetera. But telling the story in the first person and how they've addressed it, how the organization has been supportive, and ultimately for people to see that it has not affected their careers really helps to move the needle on this. And we've heard from many organizations that the first report actually gave them that permission, created that space for that kind of psychological safety to have those kinds of conversations, to normalize it. And also to talk about, so there are things you can do yourself and how can we support you on that? But what are the things that we can do organizationally to help those? And again, what I would say is that even with organizational initiatives that might be more targeted at senior leaders, there's that trickle down effect across the entire workforce.
Yeah. The thing that I still wonder about, though, is executives, for the most part, got to where they are by having a competitive instinct, right? And by, and you hate to say this, but by, sensing weakness in somebody else that then got them ahead, So I wonder whether yet we're at that point where an executive would trust an organization to accept the vulnerability, and whether the first time that person maybe didn't advance and somebody else did, it would set you to wonder whether it was your vulnerability, your admission of vulnerability, that cost you the advancement. So I wonder where we are with that whole thing.
I would say we're at different places across different organizations.
Mm-hmm.
The leaders really set the tone on these behaviors and these things that are difficult, vulnerability, authenticity. And I would say that through the pandemic, leaders have had to become more comfortable with it, not just around this issue, but just around running the business. They've had to sit with their staff and say, or be on a webinar with their staff and say, look, we don't have all the answers. I don't know where this is going, but I need to have this conversation with you so that you can help come up with the answers. And, this conversation always takes me back to the financial crisis, because I was in financial services as I mentioned, for my career. And what I remember there is there were these daily huddles every morning, and you'd have employees from different levels across the organizations. So a hierarchy of knowledge, not a hierarchy of level. The big issues would be put on the table. This is what's happened yesterday, last night, this morning in markets in other regions. This is what we need to solve for. I don't have the answers, even though they came from a place where people expected them. And let's talk, we need your help. And that's been happening in organizations. So I think we've got that momentum behind us for people to do it. But ultimately, where they can see that it hasn't affected people. And the interesting thing there about mental health is it's not unlike many other health conditions where there are differences in terms of impacts based on socioeconomic levels. With mental health, there isn't. And so, there is a bit of building the trust, and not everyone will go there, but enough people will. And an analogy that really works for me is that of an elite athlete. So if you talk to elite athletes, what they will say is that their well-being, their mental and physical health is essential to them operating at their peak performance. And it's not a one and done, or I'm going to do this, only when I'm starting to feel like issues are starting to arise, but it's something I do all the time to build up that resiliency. And I find that analogy can work with leaders who can look at that and say, athletes get a lot of professional help. They have coaches for everything, including their well-being. And those are the conversations I see happening more and more. And I love this notion of well-being and performance really being two sides of the same coin, whether it's at an individual level or at an organizational level.
Certainly, athletes also do things like visualization as part of their work in order to perform well. And executives, that's a big leap for a lot of them. In the time we've got left, I know the cliche is it's lonely at the top, and one of those recommendations here are get a peer relationship going, and many of them going, in order to be able to deal with that. But the more consequential finding in this, the recommendation of this, and the one that I think is worrisome for us as a society, although maybe not personally with some people, is the whole idea that we need to rethink work. That was a clear signal coming from those you surveyed and in the research since, that maybe this way we've been doing things actually now has to be refashioned somehow. The consequences of that globally are mammoth. Individually, they might be wonderful, but collectively, what that does in terms of extracting that energy out of the system is profound. But where do you think the rethinking will first go here?
Yeah. So here's the way that I've really started to think about it, as have others, that there is an optimal level of performance. Then it's based on an optimal level of inputs, not a maximum level of inputs. Because after a certain point, you get diminishing returns, or in fact, you start to make bad decisions. As you get more tired, more exhausted, more burnt out. And I think we can all look at our own organizations and see the waste, the busy work, things that they're hard to break, some of those habits. I observe, for example, in some organizations, you have a whole plethora of people attending meetings, and you sit back and you think, why are they here? And people are worried, if I don't go to the meeting, Are they going to make decisions that affect me, or am I less important? But even the whole meeting culture and rethinking that is a small example, but when you think of how much time is spent on it, it's massive. The other opportunity is technology. How do we more thoughtfully bring together technology and humans to improve our effectiveness, our efficiency, and to have humans do what we do uniquely well, but to actually have the technology, and it is advancing at a rapid rate. And moving away from that mindset of technology is not just about eliminating jobs. Ultimately, the view is that there will be more jobs through as we kind of move through this next cycle of technology implementation, but doing it thoughtfully, doing it in a way that is actually going to free people up to have more time to rest and rejuvenate is great. And I would say, just as a very practical example, and I'll use an example at Deloitte, where we've put in place throughout the summer months, and did that last year as well, also attached to long weekends or statutory holidays. Fridays are off. And when everybody is off across the organization, the email traffic really drops. Now, I'm also very aware that this cannot be done in all industries. But putting into place those kinds of bold initiatives, programs, and testing them out, because what we're finding is it's not bringing productivity down, but people are more energized. They're staying at the organization longer. There's a huge retention premium, and we're in a massive skills shortage right now as well. And so done well, thoughtfully, measured, really understanding the impacts, I think it's doable. I think it's time for us to give that a go and see how that works.
Well, we could talk about this study for probably hours, okay? And of all ironies, I have to get off to another meeting. So there you go.
And I'm in a different time zone, so I'm going to be having dinner shortly.
Am I not ritualized as a leader?
Exactly.
But I really want to thank you, Zabeen. It's a really good study. I'd recommend it to people. It's easy to find online, and we'll be writing about it here at Business in Vancouver. Thanks a lot for your time today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Kirk.
Zabeen Hirji is Executive Advisor at Deloitte Canada. I'm Kirk Lapointe, Publisher and Editor-in-Chief at Business in Vancouver. Thanks for watching.